Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session of the International Criminology Conference, Beyond Bias, a new paradigm for police training, emphasizing historical awareness and systemic reform. We remember you. If you have any questions for our presenter, please type them in the chat box, and she will address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Okay? So it is an honor for me now to introduce our presenter. She is Connie Marie Morris, is a distinguished criminal justice professor at the University of Omaha, Lincoln, leveraging over 25 years of extensive law enforcement experience to enrich her academic career. Having served with distinction in the Grand Rapids Police Department, Connie held many pivotal roles, including Field Training Officer, a Special Response Officer, Drug Enforcement Officer, Youth Liaison Officer, Warrant Officer, Background Investigator, Police Recruiter, and Prison Security Clerk. Her competence, patrol operations, and police procedure. She's also interested in criminal justice, of course, hiking inequity, restorative justice, social justice, and traveling and cycling. So thank you so much for being here. And yeah, the room is all yours. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mauricio. Hello, thank you for joining me today. We're going to cover an extensive topic on Beyond Bias, a new paradigm for police training. As you can tell, I am a retired police officer, but I'm also educator and podcaster. I want to talk about a paradigm shift for police training. As you know, our current police model of implicit bias training really needs an update to create a more effective and equitable system with a more focus on addressing systemic racism and historical biases. So in my Rethinking Implicit Bias training book, I explore how these concepts can be implemented into our training program to foster a strong relationship between officers and their communities. In my book, I take the how can I say that right? Implicit bias training. And we're going to move beyond just awareness, because we all have biases, into actual behavioral change and integrating emotional intelligence and empathy and cultural awareness into police training. And once again, addressing the systemic racism and promoting racial reforms. So some key points we're going to discuss is the urgent need. I emphasize urgent need for reform, police reform and training to address implicit bias and systemic racism. I cover that in chapter 10 in my book, Rethinking Systemic Racism in Policing. Point 2, introducing a new training model that integrates historical awareness and bias reduction. I discussed that in chapter 9 of my book, Historical Trauma and Police Bias. Go in detail about how that still affects society today. And then focus point 3 is a need just for honest and open discussion about race, which is essential for police reform. In chapter 1 of Rethinking the Influence of White Fragility in Race Talk. I use this book in my Police and Society class and also in my Race and Ethnicity and Criminal Justice course. So let's get started. What are the legacies of systemic racism and inequality in policing? We understand that the legacy of systemic racism in policing refers to the entrenched racial inequities and discrimination practices within law enforcement that has disproportionately affected our brown and Black communities. And we know that these are embedded within a social norms, within our policies, and in the fabrics of policing. What are they? Well, we can go back into our historical roots and talk about how slave patrols and Jim Crow laws, how the police were used to enforce racial inequalities and maintain segregation through violence and intimidation. We can also discuss inequalities when we talk about racial profiling and excessive force, police practices where individuals are stopped or were stopped and questioned and searched based on racial stereotypes rather than reasonable suspicion. And what we see the most, the high-profile killings or beatings of unarmed Black women, Black men, and now we're seeing it happen in our women. What are the reasons behind police killings? They are complex and multifaceted, and they are a combination of systemic issues. Let's talk about this one: implicit bias and stereotyping. Officers may subconsciously view Black or brown individuals as more dangerous or threatening, leading to escalation in force even when it is necessary. We know research shows that Black or brown people are seen to be more threatening in any environment, right? They are more apt to use more force quickly than to even talk. Second one is systemic racism in policing. The legacy of systemic racism in law enforcement has embedded racial disparities in everyday police practices, includes racial profiling, stop and frisk tactics, and a heightened focus on our policing our Black and brown communities. We know that those communities are over-policed. And then we also want to talk about the use of force policies and trainings. Many police departments have policies that permit the use of excessive or deadly force, especially when officers, I like to put these in quotes, perceive that their lives are in danger, even when implicit biases influence those fears. We'll get more into that fear section. What could be the cause of that? Is it insufficient training and de-escalation techniques can lead to officers to use force rather than use force first rather than as a last resort. So prioritizing control and compliance over dialogue and conflict resolution. And then another one is a lack of accountability and qualified immunity often shields officers from personal liability for killings or use of excessive force, even when their actions are unjustified, fostering a culture of impunity. Additionally, police departments and unions frequently protect officers involved in such incidents, making prosecution and discipline difficult. A lot of times you'll hear on the news that they follow policy, but many times you can't find the policies so you can verify that. And so I'm going through this quite fast because of time, but each one of these points can really be a great discussion point. And then here, fear and misinterpretation of threat. This fear factor is really a factor that it's come to my attention a lot because they use the fear factor. I mean, I'm a retired police officer. I was afraid for my life. We hear that a lot. And it says in many police killings, officers often claim they perceived a threat, such as mistaking a harmless object like a wallet or phone, or I can't see your hands, or that's a reason that their misinterpretation is fueled by heightened fear and anxiety during a tense situation, as well as racial biases associated with people with criminal behavior can be a result of deadly force. So people are dying because of no reason, because of fear and misinterpretation of threats. So in my book, I cover those topics. In chapter 4, we talk about the shortcomings of training. In chapter 5, we examine how racial bias affect police decision-making. You'll get a copy of these slides, so I'm gonna have to just kind of speed along. But each one of these points, we can go in great detail about the need for education and also the need to address deep-seated implicit bias to really address a behavior change in policing. We'll go more in detail on that later. Chapter 9 covers historical trauma and the mistrust of law enforcement in marginalized community. How does that affect the relationship if you're dealing with a community that's already dealing with past trauma and now you're over policing them? and the ongoing effects of systemic racism in our modern police practices. Chapter 16, we cover the importance of adding emotional intelligence and empathy training into our training, and also how that can actually change with decision-making policies. And also in chapter 17, we talk about police reformation, how we can reduce the use of force, implement more de-escalation techniques, and promote transparency and accountability. What's this ongoing impact that we have with this historical injustice? You know, today, racial disparity continues to affect everything from arrest rates to incarceration statistics. You know, these disparities are not just relics of the past, but they are deeply embedded in our current law enforcement practices. Tackling these systemic issues requires a commitment to reforming both individual biases and institutional policies. Can I get a shout out for that? The ongoing impact of historical injustice, as we know, and we mentioned it already, is that the arrest rates are higher for our Black and Brown community. Use of force is higher for our Black and Brown community. Police stops and also our incarceration rates. The ongoing impact is Black trauma. That's been something that I've been studying. And our Black trauma is that emotional scars that is left by the systemic racism, the continual oppression, and the violence that they see that experience on the social media or video of the death of a person of color. Black fatigue is a physical toll that the Black community feels from just the continual oppression and the killings that we are observing. It just continue to fatigue the community. And then implication, how can we put that together? These type of issues can be added to the implicit bias training just to be awareness, so that we can acknowledge these, how that maybe this can change the effects of policing and also create a little bit more empathy. How can we propose this new training focus area? Traditional police training are often prioritized by tactical skills, interpersonal and emotional competencies. You know, however, the proposed model I advocate for introduces a new balance, one that emphasizes implicit bias awareness, emotional intelligence, and community engagement. This approach ensures that officers are better prepared to de-escalate conflicts and build trust within the community. Just adding implicit bias training within every aspect of your training. Why is that important? Each of us, we have biases. And so I'm going to use some terms that may be new to you, maybe not, but we deal with this, and I mentioned this in chapter 5 of my book, which I thought was very powerful. Is latent mental construct, refers to the unconscious belief and stereotypes people hold about others without realizing it. It's kind of like when you get stuck on something in your head and you don't realize that you have that until it's acted upon. And it's a behavior phenomenon. It's how these unconscious bias show up in our everyday actions. It's similar to an incident that happened in Omaha, where this officer, it was a no-knock search warrant, and he's been trained I was a warrant officer too. I was on our SWAT team. We're trained to shoot no-shoot scenarios all day long, but on that one particular scenario, he shot an unarmed guy, and that is interesting, right? So maybe the bias has been sitting there, but all of a sudden the guy pops out of nowhere. No-knock search warrant, I mean, there's no knocking. You just come into someone's house, and he couldn't see his hands, and he shot the guy. The guy is now dead. So unconscious belief, unconscious actions. Let's go. What's the limitations of police training? One significant issue with current police training that often stops at awareness. Officers are made aware of their bias, but they're not given the tools to provide long-term training. So how do we do that? Well, most trainings from our research shows that the average implicit bias training that they receive is about 2 to 8, some I found are 12 hours of training. Research indicates that to change deep-seated mental constructs like implicit bias requires continual and sustained efforts, not just a few hours of training. So ongoing training and reflection, reinforcement are essential to ensuring that training translates into real world action and accountability. So you'll find out, yeah, we have implicit bias training, and you find out that the training is about 2 to 8 hours per year. Now, 40 hours of training at one sitting is a lot. So how do you get that training in a year, get that training in? Well, the idea is to integrate 40 hours of bias training. Doesn't mean to have a separate isolated session, because people are going to zone out, but make it effective. You have to woven into ongoing training programs. So as a retired police officer, we're always training. So ensuring that officers are constantly reflected and mitigate their biases while improving on their tactical, legal, and community engagement skills. I'm going to show you how that works. So in your tactical and firearms training, you incorporate bias awareness into your high trust scenario training and firearm tactical. So in law update, you embed it into the law updates. In de-escalation and first aid training, you highlight the role of bias in crisis management, ensuring fair treatment during de-escalation. In TASER and non-lethal force training, you address bias in the use of non-lethal force, emphasizing disproportionate use in marginalized community. And then continuous bias reflection. You spread bias training across the year. You can take different case scenarios at different departments and constantly having implicit bias before you, so you're made aware of it. And that's continuous training per research, saying that is the way you can break negative, deep-seated biases. So how do we introduce this great idea to the department? Understanding first that bias can be unlearned. And once we know that it's malleable, that it can be unlearned, that we have to focus on long-term behavior change. And so the holistic approach is to say, like we just mentioned it, making sure that you embed it into every area of your training. That is something that sets before you every time. So how do we design a training that works for every department? First of all, you have to sell it out to your leadership. Now, remember, each department is different. So every need is going to be different. And so the best way to do that is you want to secure commitment to the police leadership to champion implicit bias training reform. And so you want to present evidence-based benefits of bias reduction to improve officer safety, reduction, and complaints. So you want to sell it to the leadership. Second, you want to get the officers involved. Many times implicit bias training, they're hiring people to come in to train officers on this, and that's always rejected. It's not taken well. If you get the officers to buy in, get them to train the officer, let the officers train the officers, that would be the best benefit, because they know their people. They know the culture of their environment. Tailor ongoing training approach. This is best because it makes implicit bias training an ongoing process, and they're able to integrate it into that key training, because as a person hired to do it, they're not there all the time. So they can embed it into their existing tactical, legal, and de-escalating training and all their other training that they have. Community partnership and transparency, engage the community in it. See what they have to say. You always want to be able to do that. Second one, this is one I really love. You want to offer certification and recognition for your for professional development, because you want to integrate bias training into the performance metrics, into evaluation and promotion, and you want to hold the officers accountable for the application. And when you begin to do that, knowing that they need to be held accountable, that this is part of their promotion, that this will get an attention. It gives it more value for them. And then communicate the plan for buy-in. And we are running out of time here. And then you always want to have continual improvement, because one set of training for 1 year, it might adjust. So be able to have feedback surveys and keep adjusting the training to fit the culture as it changes, as society changes. We talk about that in my book. Challenges is really, I always talk about lack of resources, resistance, buy-in. Just like I said, you got to step by step be able to sell the product. But I think the best one is to make it part of the promotional success. Here go my famous quote: success of implicit bias training lies not in simply raising awareness, but in transforming behaviors and fostering empathy. True change happens when individuals are empowered to recognize their biases and are equipped with tools to act with fairness and compassion. And success happens when we all get together. Success, implicit bias training, police reforms, and community engagement initiative hinges on a multifaceted approach. I went through that approach. Strong leadership is always important when you want to affect change, especially long-term change. And these factors are aligned. Organizations are more likely to overcome challenges, and achieve their goals in reducing bias and improving trust between law enforcement and community they serve. And that's the goal that we want. And a final quote before I open for questions is: true training reform goes beyond knowledge. It reshapes attitudes, fosters empathy, and equips individuals to act with integrity in real-world situations. Sustainable change is only possible when training addresses the mind, heart, and behavior simultaneously. Thank you. Dang, that was quick.
Yes, that was quick, but so powerful. Thank you for your presentation, Connie. I remember the audience, please put your comments and questions on the chat box so Connie can address them. Okay. Right now, we have already a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to read it by yourself or you want me to read it.
Let me find it.
Yes, please go for it.
Okay. All right, Rita. Your suggestion training seems beneficial, but do you think that it will met with suspicion by the community? Let me read it. Really, without also providing community training to change the image of police. That's a good question. It's like I said, it has to be a buy-in by everyone. And so while police may have bias, we try to change bias. I think while police may have bias, the public may have their own bias, both. That's so true. It's going to be small steps, Cheryl, small steps. I think it's going to be about trust. And if we can get the officers to buy in, because the officers, having worked in the culture, they know the bad ones in there. If we can weed out the bad ones, right, or get them in that training and hold them accountable, I think that would develop more trust in the community. I think that would help. And let's hear the public out. They would talk to you and they will be able to share their heart on who they think the bad ones is and who think they should require training. You know, that's good. That's really good. You got any other follow-up with that question, Cheryl? You're welcome. The history with police and the community is negative, but there's some good policing out there. You know, being a former police officer, what would you suggest to improve the public perception of the police? I think what I like to see, and I teach police and society, and we do a policy analysis of police officers, police departments, you know, they get to pick one around the United States. And if they can just post their policies, make it accountable. And so when an incident happens, it's always have the students to go to that policy. What did their policy say? And did they follow policy instead of going to the media? And when we go to the policy and we see that maybe an officer shot a person in the back, is that policy? If that's not policy, what did the chief say? Are they following their policy? I think holding them accountable to their policy. The media has caused a large problem. Yes, I wrote.
Go ahead. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, it says the media has caused a large problem with the media is the issue. And as an educator, I think we got a lot of educators on this call. We should teach our students to check and verify information. The media feeds information out, and it's only like a soundbite. And when you wait a week, we find out that soundbite was wrong. It's negative. And so, yeah, you're right. Biased media, we need to check them too.
Yeah, Connie, I wanted to ask something that you kind of already acknowledged, but in your everyday working with the police force, what's the feeling you get about giving this kind of training? Are they open to analyze their own bias, or you find some resistance? Yeah, what's the everyday and the corp's reaction to it? Yeah.
I think it's resistance. It's resistance from an outer it's resistance. Because first we don't have it. You hit with resistance that we don't have it until you see it. There was an incident. I'm from Grand Rapids. So if you know Grand Rapids, Michigan, I'm in Nebraska now. And there was an incident that happened, I think in 22, where the officer stopped a person, for expired plate. The guy gets out, he's a little disoriented, maybe a little drunk. So it's expired plate. He wasn't communicating well. He tried to taser him, and the next thing you know, they're wrestling on the ground. Next thing you know, he's shooting the guy in the back of the head, right? And right away, Grand Rapids put that. I went to we're not trained that way, and so when you have leadership that knows their policy and say that's not the way it goes, it doesn't happen. But as you notice, I told you about the training. It's 2 to 8 hours training. That's not enough training to change the racial attitude. So that kind of answers your question. It's always a pushback.
Wow. Oh, it's a rough topic, right? But
it's a rough topic. It is rough.
it is.
People are dying because it's a rough topic, right? It's a rough topic.
It is.
Black and brown people are dying because
Yeah.
of fear, because of this fear. They're dying.
Wow, there's so much to do in this field. I guess we are done. We don't have any other question or comment. So yeah, I wanna thank you for this wonderful presentation. Thanks to all the assistants in the session. And remember, we can keep the conversation in the Huba platform. Okay, so feel free to write them more comments or yeah, whatever it comes to your mind in the upcoming minutes. So thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference. Okay.
Thank you.